The air on the terrace of Villa d'Oro was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and expensive tobacco, but for Julia, it smelled like impending death. The villa was a fortress of limestone and marble perched on the jagged cliffs of Sicily, the crown jewel of the Moretti family. Inside, the elite of the underworld gathered to celebrate the anniversary of a dynasty built on blood. Julia adjusted her heavy serving tray, her fingers trembling slightly. She was a ghost in this house, a girl in an oversized black uniform who polished silver and cleared ash. She was invisible, and in this world, being invisible was the only way to stay alive. But tonight, the silence was shattered. It happened in slow motion. A young busboy, barely 18 and new to the service, tripped over the hem of a heavy velvet curtain. A glass of vintage Brunello wine sailed through the air, arching like a crimson ribbon before crashing directly onto the lap of Donna Beatrice Moretti. The terrace went dead. The laughter of the capos died in their throats. The clink of silverware stopped. Donna Beatrice, the widow of iron and mother to the most feared man in Italy, didn't scream. She simply looked down at her white lace dress, now stained the color of a fresh wound. Slowly, her son, Lorenzo Moretti, the man they called the Lion of Palermo, rose from his seat. His presence was like a cold front moving over the Mediterranean. He didn't reach for a napkin. He reached for the beretta tucked into his waistband. "Do you have any idea?" Lorenzo's voice was a low, terrifying purr. "How much my mother treasures this evening? And you, a clumsy rat, have ruined it." The busboy fell to his knees, sobbing, unable to even form a word of apology. The guards stepped forward, their hands on their holsters. Death was seconds away. That's when Julia did the unthinkable. She stepped out of the shadows. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She spoke. "The stain will set if you keep him trembling there, Donna Beatrice," Julia said. The silence deepened. Lorenzo's cold eyes snapped to Julia, his brow furrowing. But it wasn't just that a servant had spoken, it was how she spoke. She wasn't using the rough, street slang Sicilian of the local villages. She was speaking a dialect so ancient, so refined, and so melodic that it sounded like a ghost from the 18th century royal courts had entered the room. It was the language of the Gattipardo, the old nobility. "The Brunello is acidic," Julia continued, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. "Salt will only scar the lace. You need white wine from the northern slopes and distilled soda immediately. If you allow me, I can save the garment before the fiber breaks." Donna Beatrice's eyes widened. She stared at Julia, not as a waitress, but as a mystery. "Where?" the matriarch whispered, her voice shaking with a sudden, strange emotion. "Did a girl like you learn to speak the language of my grandmother?" Lorenzo lowered his weapon, his gaze lingering on Julia's face, searching for the secrets hidden behind her plain facade. The invisible girl was invisible no more. If you want to see how a nobody waitress becomes the queen of the Sicilian underworld, you cannot miss a single minute of this story. This is a tale of secrets, power, and a woman who was born for a throne she never thought she'd claim. Before we dive in to continue, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss the twist coming. To the world, Julia was just a waitress with a medical debt. But Julia's reality was a carefully constructed lie. Her father had been a professor of history and linguistics, a man who had spent his life uncovering the lost traditions of Sicily. He had raised Julia on the stories of their ancestors, the fallen nobility who once ruled the island with grace before the syndicates took over. He had taught her how to speak like a queen, how to think like a strategist, and how to carry herself with a dignity that no amount of poverty could strip away. But 3 years ago, her father had been framed for a crime he didn't commit by a man within the Moretti organization. He died in prison, leaving Giulia with nothing but his books and her younger brother, Luca. Luca was the only reason Giulia was here, at the Villa d'Oro. He was in a private clinic in Rome, battling a rare form of leukemia. The treatments cost €5,000 a month, a sum that was impossible to earn legally. So Giulia had donned the uniform. She had learned to hunch her shoulders to hide her height, to keep her eyes on the floor, and to let the monsters of the city treat her like furniture. After the incident on the terrace, Giulia expected to be fired, or worse. Instead, she was summoned to the Donna's private quarters. The room was filled with the scent of old paper and expensive perfume. Donna Beatrice sat in a high-backed chair, watching Giulia as she entered. "Sit," the Donna commanded. Giulia sat, her spine perfectly straight, a habit she couldn't break even if she tried. "You are not a waitress," Beatrice said, her eyes narrowing. "I have lived 70 years, and I know the difference between a girl who serves and a girl who is hiding. Your father, who was he?" Giulia hesitated. If she told the truth, she might be killed. If she lied, the Donna would know. "He was a man who loved this island's history, Donna Beatrice. He taught me that our language is our soul." "And your mother?" "She passed when I was young. She was a Santoro." Beatrice gasped, a hand flying to her throat. The Santoros were a line of scholars and landowners who had vanished decades ago. "You are a daughter of the old blood," she whispered. At that moment, the heavy oak door swung open. Lorenzo Moretti stepped in, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. He looked at Giulia with a predatory intensity that made her breath catch. "My mother wants you to stay," Lorenzo said, his voice like gravel. "She wants a companion who knows the old ways, someone to read to her, to talk to her, someone who isn't a sycophant." He leaned down, his face inches from Giulia's. "But I don't trust you. I see the way you look at the maps in the hallway. I see the way you calculate the exits. You're a smart girl, Giulia. And in this house, smart girls are either very useful or very dangerous." "I am just a girl who needs to save her brother," Giulia replied, looking him directly in the eye. Lorenzo smirked. It was the first time she had seen him look almost human. "We shall see. If you are lying to us, I will personally ensure you never leave this cliff. If you are telling the truth, well, then Sicily might have just found its missing piece." Giulia was led to a room that was larger than her entire apartment. It was a golden cage, but for the first time in years, she felt the spark of something she thought she had lost: power. The room Giulia was given in the east wing of Villa d'Oro was a masterpiece of Sicilian Baroque. Gold-leafed mirrors lined the walls, and the bed was draped in heavy damask silk. To anyone else, it was a dream. To Giulia, it was a laboratory where she would either find a way to save her brother or be dissected by the Moretti family's suspicion. The first week was an exercise in psychological warfare. Donna Beatrice didn't just want a companion. She wanted a bridge to a past she thought was dead. Every morning at precisely 8 a.m., Giulia was summoned to the conservatory. The air there was humid and thick with the scent of lemon trees and old books. "Read to me," Beatrice would command, pointing to a stack of leather-bound volumes. They weren't just books. They were the journals of the old Sicilian families, written in that same high-born dialect that had saved Giulia's life on the terrace. As Giulia read, she noticed how the Donna's eyes would soften. The widow of iron was lonely. She had spent 40 years surrounded by men who only knew how to take and kill. In Giulia, she found a reflection of the elegance she had been forced to bury to survive the Mafia world. But Giulia knew better than to relax. She knew that every time she corrected the Donna's pronunciation or explained a historical nuance, she was digging herself deeper into a world she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, Lorenzo was a constant, shadow-like presence. He never entered the room while they were together, but Giulia would see him through the glass of the conservatory, leaning against a stone pillar, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his dark eyes never leaving her. He was waiting for her to slip up. He was waiting for the waitress to reappear and the Contessa to fail. One evening, Lorenzo intercepted her in the hallway. The lights were dimmed, and the sound of the Mediterranean crashing against the cliffs echoed through the stone corridors. "My mother is enchanted," he said, stepping into her path. He was close enough that she could smell the expensive leather of his jacket and the faint scent of sea salt. "She thinks you are a gift from the saints. But I know that girls like you don't just happen to be polishing silver in my club." "I told you why I was there, Mr. Moretti," Giulia replied, her voice a cool blade of silk. "My brother is dying. Poverty is a very effective way to make someone disappear into the background." Lorenzo reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, a dangerous contrast to his cold words. "You have the eyes of a gambler, Giulia. You're playing a long game. Just remember, in this house, the house always wins. If I find out you're a spy for the Neapolitans or the Russians, I won't just kill you. I'll make sure you're forgotten." Giulia didn't flinch. "Then I suggest you start looking for the real traitors, Lorenzo. Because while you're busy watching me, someone else is watching your throne." She brushed past him, leaving him in the dark hallway. She had just committed the ultimate sin. She had challenged the lion. But she had also noticed something in his eyes. Not just suspicion, but a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Respect. The tension in the villa reached a breaking point during the feast of Saint Rosalia. It was a time of celebration, but in the Moretti household, it was a time for business. The underbosses, the men who controlled the ports, the construction, and the shadows of Sicily, arrived at the villa to pay their respects and, more importantly, their tithes. Among them was Paolo, the family's longtime consigliere. He was a man of 60, with silver hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been Lorenzo's father's closest friend, but Giulia saw the way he looked at Lorenzo when the younger man turned his back. It wasn't loyalty, it was hunger. During the formal dinner, the conversation turned to the expansion of the ports. The men were arguing, their voices rising as they discussed modernizing the family's interests. They wanted to move away from the traditional codes and into more high-volume, high-risk trafficking. "The traditions are a shackle," Paolo argued, swirling a glass of wine. "We are in the 21st century. The old ways of honor and blood are costing us millions." Donna Beatrice's face hardened. This was a direct insult to her late husband's legacy. But before she could speak, Lorenzo turned to Giulia, who was standing quietly behind the matriarch's chair. "What do you think, Giulia?" Lorenzo asked, his voice cutting through the men's shouting. "You know the history of this island better than anyone here. Is tradition a shackle?" The table went silent. The underbosses looked at Julia with disdain. To them, she was a servant, a pretty-faced Beatrice had taken a whim to. Julia took a breath. She knew this was a trap, but it was also an opportunity. "Tradition isn't a shackle, Mr. Paolo," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "It is an anchor. In Sicily, if you lose your connection to the land and the people, you become just another gang. The people of Palermo don't fear you because you have guns. They respect you because you are theirs. If you move into the business you are suggesting, you invite the interest of Interpol and the Americans. You will trade your soul for a profit margin that will only last until the first arrest." She then quoted an old Sicilian proverb in the high dialect. "He who leaves the old path for the new knows what he leaves, but not what he finds." The room was stunned. Paolo's smile faltered. Lorenzo, however, let out a short, dry laugh. "She has more balls than half of you combined," he remarked, leaning back in his chair. Later that night, as the guests departed, Paolo cornered Julia near the kitchen. His hand gripped her arm with bruising force. "You think you're clever, little girl? You think a few fancy words make you one of us? I've seen girls like you come and go, usually in a weighted bag at the bottom of the harbor." "Then I'd be careful, Paolo," Julia whispered, leaning into him, "because I've also seen men like you. They always think they're the smartest in the room right up until the moment they realize they're the only ones who don't know the game has changed." She pulled her arm away and walked toward the stairs. She was shaking, but she had confirmed her suspicion. Paolo was the threat, and now she had to prove it to Lorenzo before Paolo's plan moved from whispers to bullets. The following afternoon, Lorenzo found Julia in the library. He didn't come to intimidate her this time. He came with a deck of cards. "Scopa," he said, tossing the deck onto a low table. "My father said you can tell everything about a person's soul by how they play this game. And what do you want to know about my soul, Lorenzo?" Julia asked, sitting across from him. "I want to know if you're a martyr or a mercenary," he replied, dealing the cards. "Scopa is a game of memory, math, and bluffing. It is uniquely Sicilian." Lorenzo played like he lived. Aggressive, taking risks, trying to sweep the table at every turn. He won the first 2 rounds easily, a smirk playing on his lips. "You're playing like a servant, Julia," he taunted. "Scared to take what's mine. If you want to survive here, you have to be willing to take the king." Julia didn't answer. She watched. She remembered every card he played. She realized he had a tell, a slight tapping of his index finger when he held a high-value card. She began to bait him. She played low, seemingly making mistakes, letting him think he had her cornered. In the final round, the Setabello, the gold 7, was on the table. It was the most important card in the game. Lorenzo moved to take it, but Julia played a card he hadn't accounted for, a card she had been holding back since the start. She swept the table. Lorenzo stared at the empty table, then at her. "You let me win the first rounds. I was learning how you think," Julia said softly. "You're a lion, Lorenzo. You look for the big kill. You don't notice the smaller pieces moving around you. That's how you'll lose your empire." He leaned over the table, his face inches from hers. The tension between them was no longer just about power. It was a physical pull that neither could ignore. "And what do you see moving around me, Julia?" "Paolo," she said, the name a heavy weight in the air. "He's not just talking about modernization. He's talking to the Neapolitans. I saw a man in the gardens tonight. Someone who didn't belong. He wore a ring with the crest of the Esposito family. Your rivals. Lorenzo's expression went cold. If you're lying to me to get rid of a man who hates you, check the books, Lorenzo. Check the shipments in the North Port. He's siphoning funds to build an army of his own. He doesn't want to modernize the family. He wants to replace it. Lorenzo grabbed his jacket and stood up. He didn't thank her. He didn't even say goodbye. But as he walked out, he paused at the door. If you're right, Julia, you just saved my life. If you're wrong, God help you. To confirm her theory, Lorenzo decided to bring Julia into the heart of the Serpent's Den. The annual maritime gala was held on a massive yacht in the harbor of Palermo. It was a neutral ground where all the major families, Sicilian, Neapolitan, and even the Russians, met to negotiate. You won't be serving tonight, Lorenzo told her as he handed her a box. Inside was a dress of midnight blue silk, the color of the deep Mediterranean. Tonight you are my guest, my fiancé from the north. You will speak that royal dialect of yours. You will charm them, and you will listen. When Julia stepped out of her room that evening, even the guards stopped to stare. The dress clung to her curves, and her hair was pinned up with a diamond comb that had belonged to Donna Beatrice. She looked exactly like what she was, a contessa. Lorenzo was waiting at the foot of the stairs. He didn't say she looked beautiful. He didn't have to. The way his hand lingered on the small of her back spoke volumes. The gala was a whirlwind of champagne, silk, and hidden daggers. Julia played her part to perfection. She spoke with the wives of the rival dons, using her knowledge of history and art to make them feel both inferior and fascinated. She was the perfect distraction. While Lorenzo was locked in a business meeting in the VIP lounge, Julia slipped away toward the stern of the boat. She saw Paolo leaning over the railing, speaking in hushed, urgent tones to a man with a heavy Neapolitan accent. The hit happens tonight, Paolo whispered. Once Lorenzo is back at the villa, the security has been compromised. I've turned the guards on the west gate. By dawn, the Moretti name will be history. Julia's blood ran cold. She turned to run back to Lorenzo, but she felt a cold barrel of a gun pressed against her ribs. Going somewhere, Contessa? A voice hissed. It was one of Paolo's loyalists. She was trapped on a boat in the middle of the ocean. The man she was beginning to love was walking into an ambush, and her brother's life depended on her survival. Things just took a deadly turn. Julia is cornered, and the Moretti family is hours away from a total massacre. Will Julia find a way to warn Lorenzo, or will the invisible Contessa disappear forever? If you're on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now and comment part 2 below. And don't forget to subscribe. The final parts of this story are going to leave you absolutely breathless. We're moving into the heart of the war next. The cold steel of the gun barrel pressed against Julia's ribs was a stark reminder that her transition from invisible waitress to mafia player had come with a deadly price. The man holding the weapon was Marco, one of Paolo's personal enforcers. Around them, the gala continued, clinking glasses, laughter, and the soft hum of an orchestra, oblivious to the fact that the fate of the Moretti Empire was being decided on the stern of the yacht. Don't scream, Contessa, Marco hissed, his breath smelling of cheap tobacco and expensive gin. Paolo wants you at the bottom of the harbor, but he didn't say you had to be dead when you got there. Julia's mind raced. Her father had taught her that in any conflict, the one who panics first loses. She needed to use the very thing the mafia underestimated, her intellect. "You're making a mistake, Marco," Julia said, her voice barely a whisper, yet infused with that same aristocratic authority that had stunned Donna Beatrice. "Do you think Paolo will let you live once this night is over? You are the only witness to his betrayal of the Moretti bloodline. He's already cleared the West Gate for the Neapolitans. Do you really think he hasn't cleared a spot for your grave, too?" Marco hesitated, his grip on the gun faltering for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. Julia didn't try to wrestle the gun away. She reached into her hair and pulled out the diamond comb Donna Beatrice had given her. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a sharp, heavy piece of heirloom silver. She slammed the metal prongs into the sensitive nerves of Marco's wrist. He cried out, the gun clattering to the deck. Before he could recover, Julia didn't run for the stairs. She dove into the one place they wouldn't expect a lady to go, the engine room hatch. The heat below deck was staggering. The roar of the massive diesel engines vibrated in her bones. She scrambled through the grease and shadows, her midnight blue silk dress tearing against the jagged machinery. She found the yacht's internal communication line, a series of old-fashioned brass pipes used for emergency signaling. She blew into the pipe leading to the VIP lounge. It was a long shot, but she knew Lorenzo was a man who noticed every anomaly. On the other end, in the silent lounge where Lorenzo was negotiating a shipping deal, a faint, rhythmic whistling sound emerged from the wall. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. Lorenzo froze mid-sentence. He recognized the signal. It was a tactic used by the old Sicilian resistance during the wars, a detail Julia had mentioned during their game of Scopa. He didn't finish his drink. He didn't excuse himself. He stood up, drew his weapon, and looked at the Neapolitan boss across from him. "The meeting is over," Lorenzo growled, "because my guest just told me you're already dead." While Lorenzo cleared the lounge, Julia emerged from the engine room, covered in grease but fueled by a cold, sharp rage. She intercepted Lorenzo in the narrow corridor. "The West Gate," she gasped. "Paolo turned the guards. They're hitting the villa tonight. Your mother. She's alone." Lorenzo didn't waste time with questions. He grabbed her by the waist and pulled her toward the speedboats docked at the yacht's stern. "If we don't make it back in 20 minutes, he said, "Sicily burns." The ride back to the cliffs was a blur of salt spray and moonlight. Lorenzo drove the speedboat like a madman, cutting through the waves at a speed that threatened to flip the vessel. Beside him, Julia held onto the railing, her eyes fixed on the distant lights of the villa. As they approached the private docks of the estate, the sound of gunfire began to echo off the limestone cliffs. The ambush had started. "Stay behind me," Lorenzo commanded as they leaped onto the stone pier. He handed her a small, elegant pistol, a backup weapon he kept in his ankle holster. "If anyone who isn't me comes through that door, you use it." They ascended the hidden smuggler's staircase that led directly into the heart of the villa. The house was a war zone. The smell of jasmine had been replaced by the acrid stench of cordite. Paolo's men had already breached the courtyard, and the sound of heavy boots thudded through the marble hallways. Julia knew the layout of the house better than the attackers. She had spent months cleaning every corner, every hidden nook. "The library," she whispered to Lorenzo. "There's a reinforced panic room behind the fresco of the Madonna. That's where your mother will be." They fought their way through the gallery. Lorenzo moved with the fluid, lethal grace of his namesake, the lion. He didn't just fire, he anticipated. But they were outnumbered 10 to 1. Suddenly, A group of mercenaries cornered them in the grand ballroom. Lorenzo shoved Julia behind a heavy mahogany table, returning fire until his magazine clicked empty. "I'm out," he hissed. Julia looked at the massive crystal chandelier hanging above the mercenaries. It was held by a single ancient winch system she had polished just 2 weeks ago. She knew the release lever was located behind a velvet curtain to her left. Without thinking, she lunged across the open floor. Bullets shredded the plaster above her head. She reached the lever and pulled with every ounce of strength she possessed. The screech of metal on metal was deafening. The 3-ton chandelier plummeted, a rain of glass and light that crushed the mercenaries instantly. In the sudden silence, Lorenzo looked at Julia, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and adoration. "You," he breathed, "are the most dangerous woman I have ever met." They reached the library just as Paolo was attempting to blow the door to the panic room. The consigliere turned, his face twisting into a mask of pure hatred when he saw them. "You should have stayed in the kitchen, girl," Paolo screamed, raising his weapon. But he was too slow. Lorenzo's bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Lorenzo didn't kill him immediately. He walked over and pressed the hot barrel of his gun against Paolo's throat. "You betrayed my blood," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "And you insulted the woman who saved my life. For that, death is too kind." The aftermath of the coup was a grim affair. The sun rose over a Sicily that felt different. Colder, sharper, but finally clean. Paolo and his conspirators were erased from the city's records. The Neapolitan families, seeing the failure of the ambush, retreated into the shadows to lick their wounds. But the victory felt hollow to Julia. In the chaos, she had received a frantic call from the clinic in Rome. Luca had taken a turn for the worse. The stress of the situation, the lack of news from his sister, and the progression of his illness had pushed him into a crisis. "I have to go," Julia told Donna Beatrice as they sat in the repaired conservatory. The older woman looked frail, the night's events having aged her a decade. "You cannot go, Julia," Beatrice said softly. "You are part of this family now. You know our secrets. You have shed blood for us. The world outside, it is no longer safe for you." "My brother is the only world I care about," Julia retorted, her voice cracking. "I didn't do this for power. I did it for him." Lorenzo entered the room, his arm in a sling. He placed a thick envelope on the table. "The clinic in Rome has been bought," he said. Julia looked at him, confused. "Bought? By whom?" "By the Moretti Foundation," Lorenzo replied. "Luca was moved an hour ago to the best private facility in Switzerland. The world's leading hematologist is flying in from New York. He will have the transplant, Julia. Everything is paid for. Forever." Julia fell into a chair, the weight of the last few months finally crashing down on her. She began to sob, not out of sadness, but out of a sheer, overwhelming relief. Lorenzo knelt beside her, his hand covering hers. It was the first time he had shown such vulnerability in front of his mother. "You saved my mother. You saved my empire. Did you really think I wouldn't save the only thing that matters to you? But there was a condition." Julia knew it before he even spoke. "You don't get something for nothing in the Mafia. You stay," Lorenzo whispered. "Not as a servant, not as a companion. You stay as my equal. The people need to see that the Moretti family is not just about fear. We are about tradition, intelligence, and loyalty." Julia looked at the Donna, then at Lorenzo. She realized she could never go back to being a waitress. The girl who polished silver was dead. The woman who had dropped a chandelier on her enemies was the only one left. "I'll stay," Julia said, wiping her tears. "But under one condition. We find the people who framed my father. I want his name cleared in the history books of this city." Lorenzo smiled. A real, dangerous, beautiful smile. "Consider it done." The following month was a whirlwind of shadow politics. While Julia visited Luca in Switzerland, seeing him grow stronger every day, Lorenzo stayed true to his word. Using Julia's father's old research and his own vast network of informants, they began to pull the thread of the conspiracy that had ruined her life. Turned out the betrayal went deeper than Paolo. It reached back to a corrupt judge and a rival family who feared Julia's father's influence on the local community. Her father hadn't just been a historian. He had been a man who was organizing the local farmers to resist the Mafia's protection taxes. One by one, the men responsible for the elder Santoro's death were brought to justice. Not through the courts the Moretti way. By the time Julia returned to Sicily, the Santoro name was being whispered with respect once again. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, uncovering the evidence that cleared her father's name posthumously. Julia stood at her father's grave in the village cemetery, a bouquet of white lilies in her hand. She felt a presence behind her. "He would be proud of you," Lorenzo said, standing a respectful distance away. "He would be horrified," Julia countered with a sad smile. "He wanted me to be a professor, Lorenzo, not the consigliere to a mafia boss." "You're not a consigliere," Lorenzo said, stepping closer. "The men are calling you something else. They call you La Contessa di Sang, the Blood Countess, because you handled the violence of this world with the grace of a queen." He took her hand, pulling her toward him. "The transition is almost complete, Julia. The other families are asking for a summit. They want to see the woman who outsmarted Paolo. They want to know if the lion has finally found his lioness." "And has he?" she asked. Lorenzo didn't answer with words. He kissed her. A deep, passionate claim that sealed her fate. She was no longer an observer of the underworld. She was its heart. The Villa d'Oro had never looked more magnificent. 6 months had passed since the night of the spilled wine. And today, the estate was hosting the most significant event in decades. Thousands of white lilies, her father's favorite, lined the grand staircase. The elite of Italy, from the politicians of Rome to the hidden bosses of Calabria, were in attendance. In her private suite, Julia stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She wore a gown of ivory Italian lace, hand-stitched by the same dressmakers who served the Vatican. Beneath the silk garter on her right thigh sat a small, pearl-handled stiletto, a gift from Donna Beatrice. "You look like a Santoro," a voice said from the doorway. Julia turned to see her brother, Luca. He looked healthy, his cheeks flushed with life, wearing a suit that Lorenzo had commissioned for him. He walked toward her without a limp, without the exhaustion that had defined his childhood. "I'm scared, Luca," she admitted. "Don't be," he said, taking her hands. "You were a queen when we were eating crusts of bread in a one-room apartment. This is just the world finally noticing." The heavy oak doors to the ballroom opened. The roar of conversation died instantly. Julia walked out, her head held high. At the end of the aisle stood Lorenzo. He wasn't wearing his usual tactical gear or a casual suit. He was in full formal attire, looking every bit the king of Sicily. Beside him stood Donna Beatrice, wearing the family's ancestral emeralds, looking at Giulia with a pride that was almost maternal. As Giulia reached Lorenzo, he leaned in and whispered, "Scacco motto, Giulia. You won the game." "We won," she corrected him. They turned to face the crowd. The bosses of Sicily stood up. They weren't just showing respect for a wedding. They were acknowledging a new era, the era of the Waitress and the Lion. Together, they had merged the raw power of the new world with the refined honor of the old. The Waitress who had once trembled while clearing ashtrays was now the woman who held the keys to the Mediterranean. She had saved her brother, cleared her father's name, and found a love that was as dangerous as it was deep. As the sun set over the cliffs, casting a golden light across the assembly, Giulia knew that the invisible girl was gone forever, and Sicily would never be the same. From a terrified waitress to the Queen of Sicily, Giulia proved that the most dangerous person in the room is always the one you don't notice. She didn't just survive the Mafia. She mastered it with her mind and her heart. Lorenzo Moretti found the one thing he never thought existed: an equal. If you enjoyed this journey of mystery, Italian romance, and karmic justice, make sure you destroy that like button. It helps the channel bring you more epic stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a chapter. Now I want to hear from you in the comments. If you were Giulia, would you have stayed for the power and love, or taken the money and run away with Luca? Let me know your thoughts below.